For 3 years, Daniel Brooks had never been late, never left early, never revealed a single detail about his life outside these walls. Then, one Friday afternoon, he walked into the CEO's office and said 7 words that stopped the entire floor. "I need to leave early. I have a date." Victoria Hale feared for her cold precision and ruthless control, felt something shift inside her chest, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. What was behind that date? And why, after 3 years of perfect silence, did it suddenly matter so much? The 47th floor of Hale Industries had its own rhythm, a precise choreography of clicking keyboards, muted phone calls, and the soft hum of ambition. At the center of it all sat Victoria Hale behind a glass desk that reflected the Manhattan skyline like a mirror. At 36, she had built an empire from the ashes of betrayal, and she wore her coldness like armor. No one got close. No one was allowed to. The employees whispered about her in break rooms and elevators, about the way she could end a career with a single glance, about the rumors that she had never taken a vacation, never attended a company party, never shown a flicker of warmth to anyone who worked for her. And yet every morning for the past 3 years, one man had occupied the desk just outside her office door, close enough to anticipate her every need, far enough to never cross the invisible line she had drawn. Daniel Brooks was the kind of man people noticed but never understood. He arrived at 7:45 every morning, 15 minutes before anyone else, and left at exactly 6 in the evening, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. His desk held no photographs, no personal items, nothing that suggested a life existed beyond these glass walls. Colleagues called him the machine behind his back, half in admiration, half in unease. He remembered every deadline, anticipated every crisis, and executed every task with a precision that bordered on unsettling. In 3 years, no one had ever heard him mention a friend, a hobby, or even a weekend plan. When coworkers invited him to happy hour, he declined politely. When they asked about his holidays, he gave vague, forgettable answers. He was a ghost who happened to be excellent at his job, and after a while, people stopped trying to know him. Victoria had grown dependent on him in ways she refused to name. She knew he took his coffee black, with exactly half a spoon of sugar, a preference she had memorized, without realizing it. He knew she needed absolute silence on the days when the pressure behind her eyes became unbearable, and he would quietly redirect calls and reschedule meetings without being asked. There were moments, brief, wordless, when their eyes would meet across the conference table, and something would pass between them. An understanding, a recognition, something that felt almost like intimacy, though neither of them would ever call it that. Once during a late night preparing for a hostile takeover, the office had been empty except for the two of them. Victoria had been staring at spreadsheets until the numbers blurred together, her neck aching, her eyes burning. Daniel had appeared at her door with a cup of tea, chamomile, not coffee, because he somehow knew she needed to sleep eventually. He had set it on her desk and said quietly, "You should rest, Victoria." It was the first time he had used her first name instead of Ms. Hale, and she had felt something warm flicker in her chest before she extinguished it. She had mumbled a thank you without looking up, afraid of what he might see in her eyes if she did. Neither of them ever mentioned it again. But she remembered. She remembered every time he said her name in those rare, unguarded moments when the professional masks slipped just slightly. She remembered the way his voice softened when he thought no one else was listening. She had learned long ago that trust was a weapon people used against you. 5 years earlier, a man named Richard Hayes had taught her that lesson in the cruelest way possible. He had been her business partner and her lover, the first person she had allowed past her defenses since college. For 2 years, she had believed they were building something together, both professionally and personally. She had shared her ideas with him, her vulnerabilities, her dreams. And he had used all of it against her. The betrayal had been surgical. He had waited until she was vulnerable, until she had let her guard down completely. And then he had dismantled everything she had built. He took her biggest clients, her most promising employees, her confidence. He left her with nothing but a half-empty office, and a lesson she would never forget. Love was just another word for leverage. Since then, Victoria had sealed herself inside a fortress of logic and distance, convinced that emotion was a crack through which destruction would eventually seep. That Friday afternoon, the office was buzzing with preparations for a major board presentation the following week. Phones rang constantly, assistants rushed between cubicles, and the energy in the air was electric with deadline pressure. Victoria was reviewing the final slides in her office when movement outside her glass wall caught her attention. Daniel had stood up from his desk, unusual given the hour. More unusual still, he was putting on his jacket. She watched him walk toward her door, something shifting in her chest before he even spoke. He stepped inside without knocking, which he had never done before, and stood in front of her desk with an expression she couldn't read. "I need to leave early today," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I have a date." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Victoria felt the ripple move through her before she could stop it. "A date," she repeated, and she hated how her voice sounded thin, too interested betraying something she had spent years burying. Daniel simply nodded, offered no further explanation, and turned to leave. She watched him walk across the open floor, watched every head turn to follow him, watched the whispers begin before he even reached the elevator. The doors closed behind him, and then she was alone, with a feeling she didn't know how to name. For the next hour, Victoria tried to focus on the presentation slides, but the words blurred together into meaningless shapes. She found her eyes drifting to Daniel's empty chair, to the perfectly organized desk that revealed nothing about the man who sat there every day. 3 years of working side by side, of late nights and early mornings, of small gestures that neither of them acknowledged, and she realized with a cold clarity that made her stomach tighten that she didn't know anything about him. Not where he lived, not who he spent his time with, not a single detail of the life he returned to when he walked out of this building every evening. The realization was followed by another more unsettling one. She cared. She cared that he had a date. She cared that some unknown person was waiting for him somewhere in this city, and that caring made her furious because caring was weakness, and weakness was something she had promised herself she would never allow again. Victoria pushed back from her desk and walked to the private balcony attached to her office. The October wind cut through her blazer as she pulled a cigarette from the emergency pack she kept hidden in her desk drawer. She only smoked when she was losing control, and she hadn't touched this pack in over a year. The flame from her lighter flickered in the wind as she brought it to her lips, inhaling deeply and watching the city sprawl beneath her. 47 floors below, people moved through their lives, going home, to families, meeting friends for dinner, living the kind of ordinary existence that Victoria had sacrificed for success. Somewhere out there, Daniel was with someone who made him smile maybe, someone who knew things about him that Victoria had never bothered to ask. The thought burned worse than the smoke in her lungs. She stood there until the cigarette was nothing but ash, then went back inside and stared at the city lights until she couldn't stand the silence anymore. Back at her desk an hour later, Victoria picked up her phone and scrolled to Daniel's number. She stared at it for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the call button. This was ridiculous. She was his boss, not his jealous girlfriend. She had no right to call him, no legitimate reason to interrupt whatever he was doing. But the not knowing was eating at her, and before she could stop herself, she pressed call. He answered on the third ring, his voice calm and professional as always. "Ms. Hale, not Victoria. The formality stung more than it should have. She scrambled for an excuse, something that would justify this call. "The Henderson contract," she said, forcing her voice into its usual commanding tone. "I need the revised figures tonight." There was a brief silence on the other end, and when Daniel spoke again, she could hear something beneath the politeness, a recognition of what she was really doing. "I reviewed those figures this morning," he said. "Everything is in the shared folder, but I can walk you through them on Monday if you'd like." Another silence, longer this time. Then quieter. "Tonight I can't." In the background, she thought she heard something, laughter, maybe, or music, the sounds of a life she knew nothing about. Victoria ended the call without saying goodbye. She sat in the dark of her office, the city lights painting shadows across her face, and felt something she hadn't felt in years, the sharp, humiliating sting of rejection. That night, Victoria returned to her penthouse on the Upper East Side. The apartment was immaculate, white marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Central Park designer furniture that had never been sat on by anyone but her. A cleaning service came 3 times a week. A personal shopper kept her refrigerator stocked with food she rarely ate. Everything was perfect, and everything was empty. She poured herself a glass of wine and stood by the window, looking out at the same city that now felt different, rearranged by a single sentence spoken by a man she thought she understood. The silence of the apartment pressed against her like a physical weight. She had built this life deliberately, every choice designed to protect herself from the kind of pain Richard had inflicted. No relationships, no vulnerabilities, no one close enough to hurt her. But standing here now, wine in hand, she couldn't escape the question that circled through her mind like a predator. Who is he with? What are they doing? Is he smiling at her, the way he sometimes smiles when he thinks I'm not looking? And worse beneath all those questions, another one she couldn't bring herself to speak aloud. Why do I care so much? She finished the wine and poured another glass. Sleep would not come tonight. She already knew that. Her mind kept circling back to the same images. Daniel's face when he said the word, date. The way his eyes held something she couldn't read, the confidence in his walk as he left the office. She had spent 3 years watching this man, working alongside him, trusting him with the most sensitive information about her company, and she had never once asked him a personal question. Never once wondered about the life he lived outside these walls. The truth was uncomfortable. She hadn't asked because she hadn't wanted to know. Knowing would make him real. Knowing would make him a person instead of a function. And if he was a person, she might start to care about him. Caring was dangerous. Caring was how Richard had destroyed her. But now, standing alone in her penthouse with a glass of wine and a weekend stretching ahead of her like a desert, Victoria realized that not caring had its own price. She had protected herself from pain, yes, but she had also protected herself from everything else. The night stretched ahead of her, empty and vast, and for the first time in years, Victoria Hale felt the walls of her fortress begin to crack. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray autumn light that made everything feel muted and heavy. Victoria had spent the weekend in her penthouse cycling between work emails and the same unanswered question that had haunted her since Friday evening. She had barely slept, barely eaten, barely done anything except replay that phone call in her mind and wonder what Daniel had been doing while she sat alone in her expensive apartment. She arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping to settle into her routine before Daniel appeared. But when the elevator doors opened at 7:30, he was already there, sitting at his desk, reviewing documents, as if nothing had changed. He looked up when she passed, offered his usual professional nod, and returned to his work. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the phone call. Nothing. Victoria closed herself in her office and tried to focus on the Henderson contract, but concentration eluded her. She kept glancing through the glass wall at Daniel's back, at the precise way he moved through his tasks, at the complete absence of anything personal on his desk. The not knowing gnawed at her, like a hunger she couldn't satisfy. She had built her entire career on information, on understanding every variable before making a move. And yet, here was a man who had worked beside her for 3 years, and she couldn't answer the simplest questions about him. Where did he go on weekends? Did he have family? Friends? A life that existed outside the fluorescent glow of this office. The ignorance felt like a failure, and Victoria Hale did not tolerate failure. By mid-morning, she had made a decision. She would be colder, more distant. She would remind herself and him that their relationship was purely professional, that his personal life was none of her concern, that she didn't care who he spent his Friday evenings with. She called him into her office for a briefing on the board presentation and kept her voice clipped, her questions sharp, her eyes fixed on her laptop screen rather than his face. Daniel answered every question with his usual competence, his tone unchanged, his demeanor unreadable. If he noticed her coldness, he gave no sign. And that somehow made everything worse. She wanted a reaction. She wanted him to acknowledge that something had shifted between them. But he simply finished the briefing, asked if she needed anything else, and returned to his desk when she shook her head. The day dragged on, each hour heavier than the last. Victoria attended meetings, reviewed contracts, made decisions that would affect hundreds of employees, and through it all, she felt Daniel's presence like a splinter beneath her skin. She watched the clock, watched him pack up at exactly 6 o'clock, watched him leave without a backward glance. The pattern repeated on Tuesday and Wednesday. By Thursday, Victoria felt like she was losing her mind. She snapped at assistants for minor mistakes, sent emails that were sharper than necessary, and spent more time staring at Daniel's desk than at her own work. She knew she was spiraling, knew this obsession was irrational and unprofessional, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. That evening, the office emptied early. A company event downtown had drawn most of the staff away, leaving the 47th floor quiet and dim. Victoria stood by her window watching the city lights flicker to life below when she heard footsteps in the hallway. She turned to see Daniel walking toward the elevator, briefcase and hand jacket already on. Something inside her snapped. Before she could stop herself, she was moving out of her office across the open floor, intercepting him just before he reached the elevator bank. He stopped when he saw her, his expression calm but watchful, and waited for her to speak. 3 years, Daniel. 3. The words came out harder than she intended, edged with something that sounded dangerously close to desperation. You know exactly how I take my coffee. You know I hate red roses. You know I need silence on the days when everything feels like too much. But I don't know anything about you. I don't even know where you live. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of something softer beneath the professional mask. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. You never asked. The words hit her like a slap. Simple. True. Devastating. She had never asked because asking meant caring, and caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. She had built her walls so high that she had forgotten there were people on the other side of them. Victoria struggled to find her footing, her usual composure crumbling in real time. Why didn't you ever tell me about yourself, about your life outside of here? Daniel's response came without accusation, just a statement of fact, delivered in that calm, measured voice she had come to depend on. Because you made it clear from day one that personal boundaries were sacred. You built walls so obvious that no one dared cross them. And I respected that. I thought that was what you wanted. Victoria felt something crack inside her chest, the first fracture in the fortress she had spent 5 years constructing. She heard herself ask the question before she could stop it, her voice smaller than she had ever allowed it to be in this building. The date on Friday. Who was it with? Daniel held her gaze for what felt like an eternity. She could see him weighing his options, deciding how much to reveal. Then, with a breath that seemed to carry years of weight, he answered. My son, Lucas. Friday was his 5th birthday. The words didn't make sense at first. Victoria heard them, processed them, but her brain refused to assemble them into meaning. "You have a son." Daniel nodded, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something quieter, more intimate. "My wife Emily died in a car accident 3.5 years ago. Lucas was 18 months old. I've been raising him alone ever since." Victoria felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She had worked beside this man, trusted him with the most sensitive details of her business, shared late nights and early mornings, and countless cups of coffee, and she hadn't known he was a father, hadn't known he was a widower, hadn't known he went home every night to a child who had lost his mother before he could remember her face. The jealousy she had felt all weekend, the burning, irrational jealousy that had kept her up at night and driven her to make that desperate phone call, now curdled into something far worse: shame. She had been jealous of a 5-year-old's birthday party. She had been jealous of a dead woman's memory. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked. And even she could hear how weak the question sounded. Daniel's answer was measured without self-pity. "Because I didn't want to be treated differently. I didn't want the sympathy, the assumptions that I couldn't commit fully to my work. I needed this job, Victoria. I needed the stability, the insurance, the structure. And I knew that the moment people found out I was a single father, they would start questioning my dedication, wondering if I could really handle the long hours, the last-minute emergencies, the demands of working for someone like you." He looked at her directly, and there was no accusation in his eyes, just honesty. "Lucas is everything to me. He lost his mother. I won't let him lose anything else. If anyone ever comes into my life, they need to understand that he comes first. Always. No competition, no exceptions." Victoria understood that he wasn't just explaining. He was warning her, drawing a line that could not be crossed. Something shifted in Victoria's chest, a tightening that felt like fear and anger and something else she couldn't name. The walls she had built were shaking, and she didn't know how to stop them from falling. The vulnerability in Daniel's words, the quiet strength of his devotion to his son, the years of silent sacrifice he had carried without complaint, it was too much. It demanded a response she wasn't prepared to give. It demanded that she be vulnerable too, that she meet his honesty with her own. And so, in the way of wounded people everywhere, she struck out at the thing that had wounded her. "You can't hide behind a child forever, Daniel." The words were out before she could stop them, sharp and cruel and immediate. "You can't use him as an excuse to avoid actually living your life." The moment the sentence ended, Victoria knew she had made a terrible mistake. She watched Daniel's face transform, the softness vanishing, replaced by something cold and distant. The warmth that had flickered in his eyes moments ago was gone completely. When he spoke, his voice was ice. "I think you should go home, Miss Hale." Miss Hale. Not Victoria. In those rare late nights when no one else was around, he had started calling her by her first name. Small moments of warmth she had pretended not to notice, but secretly treasured. She had saved those moments, hoarded them like precious things, replayed them in her mind, when the penthouse felt too empty. The return to her formal title was a door slamming shut, a wall going up that she herself had taught him how to build. Daniel turned and walked away. He didn't look back. The elevator doors opened, swallowed him, and closed again, leaving Victoria alone in the empty hallway, with the echo of her own cruelty ringing in her ears. She stood there for a long time, unable to move, replaying the conversation in her mind. She had done exactly what Richard had done to her, attacked the most vulnerable part of someone when she felt threatened. She had taken Daniel's love for his son, the purest thing he had, and weaponized it against him. She had become the very thing she feared. Victoria returned to her penthouse that night and didn't bother turning on the lights. She sat in the darkness of her living room, the city glittering through the windows like a mockery of everything she had built. The wine sat untouched on the counter. She didn't deserve the comfort. She thought about Daniel going home to Lucas, tucking him into bed, reading him stories, being everything that little boy needed. and she thought about herself alone in this expensive tomb surrounded by things that meant nothing. She had spent 5 years protecting herself from pain, and in doing so, she had become the kind of person who inflicted it on others. The question hung in the darkness unanswerable. Could she change, or would she always be this cold defensive, destroying anything that came too close? She had spent so long building her armor that she wasn't sure she knew how to take it off, and even if she could, was there anything left underneath worth showing? The weekend passed in a blur of self-recrimination and sleepless nights. Victoria replayed the conversation in the hallway dozens of times, each replay making her cringe more than the last. She heard her own voice saying those terrible words, "You can't hide behind a child forever," and wanted to disappear. She thought about calling Daniel, texting him, showing up at his desk Monday morning with an apology. But what could she possibly say that would undo what she had done? Some wounds couldn't be healed with words. Friday came and went. Daniel arrived at the office at his usual time, completed his tasks with flawless precision, and left at exactly 6 o'clock. He answered Victoria's emails within minutes, prepared her briefings without a single error, and anticipated her needs before she voiced them. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. But Victoria knew better. Something fundamental had shifted. The lingering glances were gone. The small moments of wordless understanding had vanished. He no longer brought her tea on difficult days, or said her name in that soft way that made her chest ache. He was present in body, competent in action, but absent in every way that mattered. Victoria found herself watching him through the glass wall of her office, trying to pinpoint exactly what had changed. And then she understood. This was what it looked like when Daniel Brooks was simply doing his job. Before he had been there fully, completely, in ways she had taken for granted. Now he was only present. The difference was devastating. On Saturday morning, Victoria sat alone in her penthouse, with her laptop open, searching for something she knew she had no right to find. She typed Emily Brooks into the search bar and scrolled through results until she found a small article from 3.5 years ago, buried in the archives of a local news site. The headline was simple: "Local woman killed in highway collision." The article was brief, clinical, detached. Emily Brooks, 29, had been driving home from a grocery store when a truck ran a red light. She was pronounced dead at the scene. She was survived by her husband Daniel and their 18-month-old son Lucas. There was a photograph attached to a follow-up piece about the funeral granny taken from a distance. Daniel stood beside a small casket, holding a baby in his arms. His face was turned away from the camera, but his posture told the whole story. A man trying to hold the pieces of his world together while everything crumbled around him. Victoria stared at that image for a long time. She tried to imagine what it must have been like to lose the person you loved most, to be left alone with a child too young to understand, to have to keep going when everything inside you wanted to stop, and then to come to work every day to smile politely at colleagues, to pretend that nothing was wrong because you couldn't afford to be seen as weak. Victoria closed the laptop and sat in the silence of her apartment. The tears came without warning, hot, ugly, unstoppable. She couldn't remember the last time she had cried, like this couldn't remember the last time she had allowed herself to feel anything this raw. She cried for Daniel, for Lucas, for Emily, whom she had never met, and she cried for herself, for the woman she had become so armored against pain that she had forgotten how to recognize it in others. She thought about what Daniel had endured coming to work every day, with that weight on his shoulders, never complaining, never asking for special treatment. He had carried this burden alone for 3 years, never letting it affect his performance, never using it as an excuse. And when he had finally trusted her with the truth, when he had finally let her see behind his own walls, she had thrown it back in his face like a weapon. She had taken the most precious thing in his life, his love for his son, and used it to hurt him. The shame was overwhelming. She had spent 5 years telling herself that she was protecting herself, that her coldness was a survival strategy. But the truth was uglier than that. She had become someone who inflicted pain because she was afraid of feeling it. She had become Richard. By Sunday evening, Victoria had made her decision. She pulled Daniel's address from the HR files, something she had never done, never needed to do, never wanted to do. The address led to a neighborhood in Brooklyn she had never visited, a world away from the gleaming towers of Manhattan where she spent her days. She took a cab across the bridge and stood on the sidewalk outside a modest brick building, looking up at windows that glowed with warm yellow light. She stood there for almost 20 minutes, arguing with herself, finding reasons to leave, and then finding reasons to stay. Finally, she found the courage to climb the stairs and knock on door 4B. The sound of her knuckles against the wood felt like the loudest thing she had ever done. Daniel opened the door, and his expression shifted through several emotions, in rapid succession. Surprise, wariness, something that might have been hope quickly suppressed. He was wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt, his feet bare, his hair slightly disheveled. Victoria had never seen him like this, stripped of the professional armor he wore at the office. He looked younger somehow, more human. From somewhere inside the apartment, she could hear the bright sounds of a cartoon playing and the occasional giggle of a child. Daniel didn't speak. He simply stood in the doorway, waiting, leaving the next move entirely to her. Victoria's voice came out smaller than she had ever allowed it to be. "I didn't come here as your boss." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I came because I need to apologize. What I said about Lucas, about you hiding behind him, that was the worst thing I've ever said to anyone. And you're the last person who deserved to hear it." Daniel remained silent, his expression unreadable. Victoria pressed on the words, tumbling out faster now, as if she was afraid she would lose her nerve. "I don't know how to care about people, Daniel. I built walls so high that I forgot how to climb over them myself. But when you told me you had a date, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I was scared of losing you. And because I didn't know how to handle that fear, I attacked the thing that mattered most to you. I became exactly the kind of person I've spent my whole life trying to protect myself from." Daniel's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "You want to know why that hurt so much? Because I thought you understood me without needing to be told. I thought we had something not romantic, not defined, but something real. And then you proved that you're just like everyone else, ready to use someone's weakness against them the moment you feel threatened." Victoria absorbed the words like blows, each one landing exactly where it was meant to. She didn't defend herself, didn't offer excuses. "You're right," she said simply. "I was exactly like everyone else. But I'm trying not to be that person anymore. I don't know if I can change, but I want to try." Before Daniel could respond, a small figure appeared behind him, peering around his leg with wide, curious eyes. Lucas had his father's dark hair and a smile that seemed too bright for the weight of his history. "Daddy, who's that?" he asked, his voice high and clear. Daniel looked down at his son, then back at Victoria. Something in his expression softened just slightly. "This is a friend of Daddy's," he said. "Her name is Victoria." Lucas studied her with the unfiltered intensity of a 5-year-old. Then he grabbed Daniel's hand and pulled. "Come see my picture, Daddy's friend." Victoria found herself being led into a small living room filled with toys, books, and the comfortable chaos of a home where a child actually lived. It was nothing like her penthouse, cluttered and colorful and alive, in a way that made her throat tighten. Lucas pointed proudly to a drawing taped to the wall, 2 stick figures rendered in wobbly crayon, one tall and one small. "That's me and Daddy," Lucas explained. "Daddy says Mommy lives in the sky now, so I don't draw her anymore." He pointed to an empty space next to the tall figure. "But I left this part blank, in case someone wants to stand there someday." Victoria felt her throat close. It wasn't a question, Wasn't a request, just a child's simple statement of hope, offered without agenda or expectation. The innocence of it, the quiet loneliness hidden beneath the bright words, broke something open inside her. She thought of her own empty apartment, her perfectly arranged furniture, her life designed to keep everyone at a distance. And she thought of this little boy drawing pictures, with space for someone who might never come. She looked at Daniel and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. She knew he could see the tears she was fighting to hold back, knew he could see past the armor she usually wore. And for the first time, she let him. "I don't know if I can be the person who stands there," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I deserve to be, but I know that I don't want to live in empty rooms anymore. I don't want to be alone." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than she had ever heard it. "I don't need you to be perfect, Victoria. I don't need you to have all the answers. I just need you to be real. And if you want to try, if you really want to try, then we'll go slow. Lucas comes first. That's not negotiable." Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice. "I understand." A small smile crossed Daniel's face, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since that Thursday evening. "There's one more thing," he said. "If you are going to be part of our lives, you need to learn how to build Lego. Lucas takes it very seriously." Victoria laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her before she could stop it. The sound felt strange in her own ears, unfamiliar after so many years of controlled smiles and calculated expressions. Lucas looked up at her with approval. "I can teach you," he offered generously. "We can start with the easy ones." An hour later, Victoria sat cross-legged on the living room floor, struggling to connect two pieces of a Lego car, while Lucas patiently guided her hands. Daniel watched from the kitchen, a cup of coffee warming his palms, his eyes soft with something that looked almost like hope. The apartment was small, cluttered, nothing like the pristine penthouse where Victoria spent her nights. But it was warm. It was alive. It was full in a way that all her expensive furniture and designer art had never managed to be. When Victoria finally left, Lucas pressed something into her hands, a piece of paper folded crookedly. "For you," he said. "I made it." She waited until she was in the cab home to unfold it. The drawing showed 3 stick figures this time, 1 tall one, medium, 1 small. Beneath them in uneven letters, Lucas had written, "Daddy's friend." Victoria traced the lines with her fingertip and felt tears slip down her cheeks. Back in her penthouse, Victoria placed the drawing on her desk, propping it against her laptop, where she could see it every day. The apartment was still quiet, still empty of other voices. But for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like possibility, like the blank space in Lucas's drawing waiting to be filled. She picked up her phone and typed a message to Daniel. "Next time I want to learn how to build the spaceship." The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then his reply, "Lucas says you have to pass the car test first. He has high standards." Victoria smiled, a real smile, alone in her apartment, with no one to perform for and nothing to prove. A new chapter was beginning, not built on power or control or the careful management of distance, built on something fragile and terrifying and utterly worth the risk, understanding responsibility and hope.